A quote often attributed to Holy Roman Emperor Charles V goes something like this: "I speak Latin to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." While humorous, it shows the linguistic landscape of the 16th century. In such a fragmented world, one needed more than one language to survive. An odd idea for today, where 1.5 billion people around the world know English. Meaning, if you know English, you can hold a conversation with 20% of the human population. It is the modern lingua franca, the language of trade, commerce, and travel. But lingua franca? What is that? When talking about the lingua franca, it is important to differentiate. Lingua franca applies to two distinct concepts: the difference between lowercase lingua franca and uppercase lingua franca. Lowercase lingua franca refers to the linguistic category or concept of lingua franca, meaning, exactly, a language that is adopted to communicate between two speakers whose native languages are different. Today, when some refer to lingua franca, they are most likely referring to this modern term, but it is from the uppercase lingua franca this concept is derived. The uppercase lingua franca refers to an exact language, or a linguistic mystery, a simplified trade language used in the Mediterranean mainly between the 13th and 17th century. While it is not constant through its poorly recorded history, enough evidence exists to suggest it was linguistically romantic in nature, but it was not the first lingua franca, lowercase. Earlier in history, Latin took the role of lingua franca, and many other languages would follow after in a similar vein. So how did this Mediterranean lingua franca come to be? Mediterranean lingua franca was largely a product of contact between European Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims, close exchange that resulted from European expansion into the Mediterranean, as the Crusades brought the two societies into much closer contact. A contact that facilitated both warfare and trade. Not only was a language between Europeans and Arabs necessary, but so was one between fellow Christians. Few within the great mass of the Crusades shared any language. Even some who did found each other's dialects unintelligible. While the educated lords knew Latin, even this was not enough. Very few crusaders could write their own language, much less speak Latin, meaning the vast majority of troops were both illiterate and often isolated into cultural groupings. As such, a sort of simplified, utilitarian language was developed, later evolving into lingua franca. Very little of lingua franca was ever written, being a verbal jargon that developed to communicate bare necessities, meaning much of its history is obscure and early forms completely forgotten. It likely emerged as a pseudo-Italian dialect referred to as Franco in the 1100s, one probably used among soldiers in the Holy Land, suggesting lingua franca developed in the Levant among Europeans. But following military exploits in the Middle East brought it further. Soon it began to be employed between European and Arab traders, as the newfound goods in the East were desired by Europeans. This early form of lingua franca was adopted to facilitate exchange. Because of its usefulness, lingua franca as a trade language soon expanded across the Mediterranean, becoming a vernacular to both sailors and merchants. By the 13th century, lingua franca had fully emerged as a unique language, to a disputable degree of the word. The linguistic diversity of the Mediterranean region made multilingualism a necessity, especially for trade. Lingua franca became the language of trade purely on how versatile and easy its simplicity was. The fluctuating borders of the Mediterranean from the 13th to 18th century made language and politics fluid, so a distinct common language was important. First appearing in the Levant, lingua franca was common to both Christians and Muslims, as it was a mixture of both Italian and Spanish adopted to Arab syntax, with it later adopting other terminology depending on which power's language was the most dominant in the region. Employed by both merchants, pirates, and slaves, lingua franca was heavily modified by the speaker's native tongue. With Venice being the most dominant trade power in the region, lingua franca, for most of its history, was highly Italian-influenced. But was lingua franca exactly Italian? Records written in lingua franca are largely non-existent, as it was never a literary language, or was it intended to be. Those who could write were often educated enough to write in Italian, the then diplomatic tongue of the Mediterranean, meaning writing in a fragmentary imitation of Italian would be pointless, leaving only vague and conflicting observations by outsiders, who were often unacquainted with the language, While attested by many, few travelers were ever desperate enough to speak such a guttural tongue as lingua franca. Because of its vulgar simplicity, it is often suggested lingua franca was just poorly spoken Italian, one used by foreign merchants, uneducated sailors, and slaves who had no concept of the language. To a degree, this is true. Many at the time spoke multiple languages, but few spoke any with any proficiency. Lingua franca was at least partly derived from Italian, a language its speakers probably had little fluency in, meaning it evolved from the earlier, more obscure Franco used by the Crusaders, until trade began to employ it for wider use, developing from a sort of dialect into a pidgin language. At the very least, lingua franca was based on the Latin-derived Romantic languages. In the Western Mediterranean, the power of Castile and Aragon, later united as Spain, gave it a Spanish persuasion. As attested by Miguel Cervantes in Don Quixote, where he referred to lingua franca as a mixture of all languages, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, developing Italian features, where it was referred to by Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a sort of Levantine Venetian, as then, Venice was the dominant trade power in the region, reinforcing lingua franca's possible Italian origins. While rarely used by educated Europeans, lingua franca was widely employed in North Africa, where, centuries earlier, Spanish Muslims had fled to, followed by European renegades in the following centuries. Combining European outlaws, Maghrebi rulers, and an assortment of slaves, a shared language was necessary, as many, either for revenge or fortune, raided Mediterranean trade as pirates. A language found in lingua franca, which was used in both trade and governance in the region. A shared trait for the populations of Muslim corsairs and European pirates, populations famous for raiding Mediterranean trade until the 19th century. Lingua franca did, in fact, persist longer in northern Africa than the rest of the Mediterranean. The best recorded branch of lingua franca was a French-influenced one that survived in the Barbary States, one studied during the French invasion of Algiers in the 1840s. It was later referred to as saber by scholars, but under direct French influence, the dialect soon vanished, replaced by actual French, a language much more useful in the now French-suppressed and colonized Algeria. As colonial European ambitions expanded into the Mediterranean and Africa, lingua franca was soon discarded. European empires soon began to regulate trade and make use of their own languages, meaning multilingualism was much less of a necessity. In the colonial bureaucracy, it was better to proficiently know your superior's language rather than know scarcely a few of them. Contact between Europeans, Middle Easterners, Africans, and Asians became much more regulated, meaning lingua franca could be abandoned for much more useful languages, in a more standardized diplomatic system. So, without purpose, lingua franca slowly withered away into obscurity. But its obscurity does not mean it never existed. Scholarly interest in the 20th century ignited a search for information on lingua franca. But what has been turned up is little of substance, be it either bad Italian or an actual language. Lingua franca existed in some form. The later French branch is much better recorded, but information on the earlier Italian and Spanish varieties is basically non-existent. Every facet of lingua franca is highly disputed, even its name. The terminology of lingua franca's name is based around the term franca. While Italian in form, the term is most likely much older, deriving from either Arabic, Greek, or another language. Some take the term franca to mean free, suggesting a mercantile naval origin. Others believe it derives from the term franc, a word used by Arabs to refer to all Europeans, which, itself, evolved from the original word franc for the French, thus eventually becoming the Italian lingua franca, or Frankish language. And with the language so mired in mystery, both origins are completely possible, but no conclusive information exists to confirm or deny either one, and it most likely never will. Well, it was not the first lingua franca. Lingua franca is perhaps the most interesting of its type, if only for its obscurity and long, bizarre history, touching nearly every port in the Mediterranean. Its emergence was just as chaotic as its existence and its end. What can be concluded is that lingua franca seemed so prevalent in Mediterranean life, it was irremarkable, until it was gone, leaving a multitude of tantalizing but inconclusive accounts and references. A unique language, or just bad Italian and Spanish. In the eyes of outsiders, it was something strange and remarkable. But lingua franca was never meant to be put to pen and paper. Or video, for that matter.